Welcome to Love and Trauma, the real deal. I'm Danielle Sebastian, best-selling author, coach, and yes, I've been through the marriage trenches myself. This show is all about how to actually deal with trauma in relationships and make it work without losing your mind. If you're ready for honest talk, no fluff, and tools that cut through the noise, tune in because let's face it, love can be a bit of a mess, but it's a mess worth figuring out. This is Love and Trauma, the real deal.
Sit down with Carmen today. I was actually in Miami. A lot of you know that I've been getting a lot of my interviews from my time in Miami with the Women Thrive group. They had a retreat and then they also had the launch of their fourth edition book. Yes, there it is. And Carmen had a chapter in the book that was amazing. And so I wanted to have her on the show today to talk about her experiences. Thank you so much for being here.
Oh, thank you. It's an honor and a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. So why don't you tell me just a little bit, the summary of your chapter and what, you really wanted to drive home with that chapter.
I usually share and introduce myself as a little girl from Cleveland, Ohio, who is still adulting in this life. There's always some new nuances, and so I'm still on this adult journey. But my intention was to be as vulnerable and transparent as possible, in a way that it would help to inspire and encourage other women. I know that women, regardless of where we are in the world, we have all had some stressful, even sometimes traumatic experiences, and just wanted women to know that they're not alone and that nothing that has been a part of our life is wasted. It's, all to bring it to all together that we can have the best life possible and be able to lead others forward.
I think you did that very well in your chapter.
Oh, thank you so much.
So let's start sort of at the beginning. I would say that one of the events that you talk about in the book that significantly, changed you and kind of set the trajectory for your life was finding out when you were 8 years old that your biological father was not who you thought it was.
Yeah, it was actually my stepfather. And so from, as far back as I can remember, which is interesting how the brain works. The more I intentionally focus on remembering things, the more things come up. And so I can remember being probably around 3 or 4. I remember my first day of official school, and he was in my life at that time. He and my mother were actually married. And so, as a child, naturally, you think nothing different. So, they have the same last name. He's my dad. And whatever was going on in the adult aspect of things between them as a married couple, much of that I did not know and learn until I got much older. But there came a point in time, for whatever reason, that my mother and he were, I believe, on the verge of separating. And my mother felt that she needed to share with me that my biological father was actually not the man that I had known as my father. And so what subsequently happened, my stepfather and my mother separated. They subsequently, at some point in time, got a divorce. And my biological father and I began a relationship by the coordination of my mother. My biological father was actually in prison when I first met him. And so I don't know how I absorbed all of that, but somehow I did. And from, a psychological therapeutic perspective, I know that it was absorbed in my body, and I have carried some things with me in my body for quite a long time. But the personality that I have, I just learned how to forge ahead. And so my mother took me, I remember very vividly the first time meeting my biological father. He was
Yeah,
in
so tell
prison.
me just about that.
Yeah.
So as soon as you found out you wanted to meet him,
Well, it was my mother's
tell me.
coordinating. I don't recall her really like asking me if I wanted to go see.
Really?
It was
Okay.
more of, this is your dad, this is where he is, and we're going to be going to visit. I was a pretty compliant child until I got a little older. So I didn't
Yeah.
really ask a whole lot of questions. And I was still quite young. And so I remember her and I riding the Greyhound bus to the area where he was incarcerated, and meeting him for the first time. And it was a good meeting. It was a good visit. I remember him very vividly coming out in his attire that kind of marks you as an inmate. But he was clean shaven, very low haircut, very attractive, dark skinned African American man. And I could, tell some visual relationships, we had the same kind of nose. And so he seemed to be very interested in me and asked me a lot of questions and really tried to connect. He and my mother seemed to have a very, agreeable conversation, which wasn't like the conversations that her and my stepfather had as we got closer to them separating.
Did he know about you from birth?
Yes. So what I later found out when I was much, much, much older,
Yes. The dirt.
that I actually had other siblings. And so, yes, he has always known. He actually fathered myself and my half sister at the same time frame. So my mother and her mother were both pregnant at the same time. So I have a sister that is about 7 to 10 days older than I. So he was a busy guy.
He was busy. Okay. Yes. And so when you found out that there was additional family members, did you reach out?
And so I didn't find that out. I don't recall exactly the duration of time. I know that when my biological father came, when he was paroled, he came to live with my mother and I. And I was in about the 5th, 6th grade. I remember it was like right around the time that I was getting ready to prepare to go to middle school. The middle school that when I grew up, we had 7th and 8th grade only in middle school. So I was still in elementary school and he came to live with us. And it was about a year or so before I went to middle school. So somewhere between him living with us and my going to middle school is when I became aware that I had other siblings. So I actually have a sister that's about a week and a half older than I. And then I had 2 other siblings, but they have since passed away. So I have a brother that I'm about 5 years older than he. And then I had a sister who I was about 7 years older than. And so all of them were conceived during the time that he and my mother also had a relationship.
Oh, yes. And you were essentially raised as a single child.
Yeah, my mother and I, unfortunately, for various reasons, I believe there was just a lot of marital discord because my mother and father were never legally married. I actually later found out that he, whenever that took place, actually married the mother of my siblings. And that was a very contentious thing for my mother. She loved my father dearly and always wanted to be married to him. But for whatever reasons, that was not the case. And so at some point in time when I was in high school, they actually separated. And so I didn't directly reach out to my siblings. My father would actually take me to visit with them. And it, as a child, you're not comprehending all the nuances of things. But I could feel that they really weren't like connected to me. It was more of my father trying to bridge the connection. They weren't unkind or anything when I was around, but the only time that we had any interaction was when my father would take me to visit with them where they were.
Okay. And then your relationship, or your mom's relationship with the stepdad, was also pretty tumultuous.
It was, I think, around that time frame again, whenever my mother decided that marriage was no longer what she wanted. And I believe at some point she probably shared with him the reasons, and a part of those reasons was my father. And they had some volatility verbally, and even physically a few times. But then he moved out. Still, I maintained a relationship with him, and he with I, and even with some other family members on his side of the family. I had, who I felt were cousins that didn't live too far from my mother and I would go over to visit them. We actually were in the same high school together. So it did not impact the relationship I had with his side of the family, which was very different than the relationships I had with my biological father side of the family. So I was actually a little bit closer to my stepfather's family than I was to my biological father's family.
Wow, that's a lot.
Yeah, but you don't rationalize those things until you're
no, and I don't think
as
a kid that you think this is normal, right? Probably
right.
You didn't.
It was my normal, so
yeah.
I didn't think anything different. Yeah.
So how did those personal experiences end up showing up, like when you started dating?
It took a while for me to realize that Carmen had some things to deal with.
I bet.
As a preteen and teenager, I thought I was doing good. I had many, I think, the imagination can be a wonderful thing. And so as a young child, being an only child, I did a lot of imaginative play. And I vividly remember those things. And as a preteen, I would make my family. So I had friends that I hung out with, and cousins I would visit often. And so I filled the gap of what wasn't at home with other people and other family connections. And so those times were good. But in between those times, what I know now that I didn't know then is I had some depression. And there were moments where I would be really sad. And my mother pretty much categorized it as me being introverted and just kind of to myself. But what I know to be true as an adult is I was depressed.
And it sounds like you went to high school and then the military.
Yeah, so high school was my not really rebellious, but I think unconsciously I was trying to just overcome the obstacles. As normal teenagers do in their own way. I wanted to fit in, I wanted to be popular, I wanted to have friends. And so whatever it kind of took to do that, sometimes without my mother knowing,
yep,
I would be with the group, with the in crowd. To the point, again, because there was a void in me to wanting to belong to something, and feel a part and feel connected. And I really feel that the core of that was just really wanting a healthy, holistic family. What I noticed, though, I struggled with academics. And so I think that, as an adult looking back, what I could say is I didn't have the attention and focus, and I didn't grasp some of the foundational core areas. And I can even remember in elementary school really struggling with grammar and sentence structure and arithmetic. And that really carried on throughout, really even still today. And so I think that some of my ability to learn was impacted by things happening at home.
Yeah. And maybe you just learned it differently than other people too, because you now have a degree, right?
Yeah, it's again, the brain is just amazing to me. I love studying the brain because it's just so phenomenal, the way that we are geared. So I learned how to adapt. I learned how to hide some things. And so I didn't take certain kind of classes because I knew I was going to struggle. I took what I had to take. And so, I did pretty well in anything that didn't have to do with grammar and math. So science was a challenge sometimes.
Focused on your strengths.
Oh my gosh. Remember that periodic table? We fought.
It's brutal.
Yeah, but I graduated, with high school, not with honors, but I graduated, with pretty good average. But when I joined the military, which wasn't initially my idea.
Okay.
As I said, on the surface, I was pretty compliant. And so I think my mother had great wisdom that it really took me a long time to really not acknowledge that and understand it. But she knew some of the areas that I was struggling in and was going to struggle. And I'm like, I want to graduate and go to college. My mother's like, and who's going to pay for that? I think her way of saying you're not really college material right now was, how about we look at some other options? And so I had two uncles that were in the Army during Vietnam, and they had since gotten out and were working for the bus system. And so she had a conversation with one of them. They were both her brothers. And so however they got together, they decided it would be a good idea for me to join the Army as well. And I was in my 11th grade of a year of school. And so I vividly remember my mother making all the coordinations, and the recruiter came to our home, and we were all sitting at the table, and they were just talking and, making plans. And I was just sitting there like, okay, I guess they'll tell me what I'm going to do.
Were you panicking? Were you panicking?
I wasn't panicking. I wasn't anxious. I just, I don't think I really knew what I was getting into.
Yeah.
And in spite of everything that had happened in my family, I still believed that my mother knew best and that I trusted her. And I didn't have any reason to not trust my uncle. He'd been in the Army, and he did very well for the most part. And so I was like, oh, okay, if I'm not going to college, I don't have any money to pay for me to go. I'm not getting any scholarships. And I didn't really know about grants. And so I thought, well, why not? But what I began to feel once I left home, and I think I still am. I'm the kind of person, if I'm going to do something, let's jump in and get it done. And so it wasn't even a full month after graduation that I left from home. I graduated in June and I left in July-ish. And so I didn't have any. Go ahead.
Where did you go? Where was your stay?
So I signed up to be a medical attendant. And so my first place of basic training, everyone has to go through, regardless of the branch of service, for, learn about the military and make sure you're physically fit to fight and all those things. And so my basic training was in Alabama.
And then where did you get?
And then from there, my first official assignment was in Germany. And that was a big culture shock.
That's a long ways away.
It was. And the only other time I had been to a foreign country was when I went on a trip vacation-wise to Puerto Rico. But this was like, okay, really, I'm by myself. And I really began to feel that. And with the adult adjustments Unconsciously, I started to feel a little resentful. And I started to harbor some other emotions, like, being a little rough and gruff with my mother, when I would talk with her. And I think for me, it was the way of saying, I really didn't want to do this, but I did it because you thought it was a good idea. And this is hard for me. And I really would have rather been at home and going to college. So she and I really didn't get the opportunity to talk about that because I really didn't share it with her until a couple of years later. But I had harbored that for a while, to the point where when it was time to what we call re-enlist, I had told my mother I wasn't going to re-enlist.
Good for you.
I was trying to get a message to her.
Was that hard? Was it hard?
It wasn't hard, but I ended up re-enlisting. So I think I was a little conflicted.
Oh.
And I think I kind of wanted her to feel my pain a little bit. Yeah. But outwardly, what most of my family members said, and still today, is, but you've always done really well. We didn't know you were having a problem.
You held it so well, girl.
Yeah, because I had that, way of just learning how to adapt. And I never really shared my, heart feelings earlier on in my life. I just did what I had to do. But once my mother and I really sat down and had a talk about it, she was like, well, why didn't you tell me that earlier? And, I love my mother. I love my father. And I didn't want to be a burden for them or put a burden on them. So I kind of shouldered it myself.
Tell me about meeting your husband. Banging your head against the wall, trying to navigate the complexities of a relationship impacted by childhood trauma, it doesn't have to be this daunting. When you're married to a partner with unresolved childhood trauma, it can feel like you're walking on eggshells, never quite knowing what will set them off. No matter what you try, it feels like there's always something triggering another emotional response that seems completely out of context. And the harder you try to fix it, the more discouraged you feel. So what's the issue here? Navigating marriage with a trauma survivor is different. The love languages don't work. Date nights don't work. Self-help books don't help. But here's the good news. I've created something that does work. Something built from years of hard-earned lessons and real-life experience. Ready to take the first step toward real change? Let's talk. I'm offering a free one-on-one call where we'll dive into what's going on in your relationship and figure out a way forward together. This isn't just another quick chat. It's a chance to finally be heard, to share what you're going through with someone who truly gets it. No judgment, just real support. So if you're ready to start making sense of it all and find a little more peace in your marriage, book your free call now. Your happiness, your peace, and your relationship are worth it. Let's do it together.
Time in Germany, I had some other schooling. And when I became a respiratory therapist, my first place of work was in Oklahoma, Fort Sill, Oklahoma. And that's where he and I met. So we're both in the medical field, and I was a respiratory technician and he was a medical technician. He repaired the equipment, medical maintenance. And so from time to time, we would have equipment we would have to take to get checked and for safety and various reasons. And they would come up and check the equipment as they did throughout the hospital. And so he and I met at the hospital where we both worked. And because I had had some not the most favorable dating experiences, by that point, I was like, I don't want to date nobody else. I just want to
I'll be single.
live my life.
Mm-hmm. I understand.
Yeah. So he, tried to court me, so to speak, and I gave him a really hard time.
Oh my gosh. I love it. So how did he break you?
He just kept being persistent, which is generally his personality anyway. And I think that, the primary thing that I was seeking, in addition to a healthy family, was just genuine love, just to be loved for who I am. No expectations, no demands. And so, he kind of provided that. He would compliment me on how I looked, and he would compliment me on my intellect, and like, oh, you're a respiratory therapist, so you're pretty smart, huh? He would just say little jokingly kidding kind of things, but I took it to heart. And he, showed genuine interest, unlike in some other relationships, they want other things, but he seemed to be genuinely interested in learning who I was and being more acquainted with me. And that, kind of grabbed my heart a little bit.
Oh, I like that. You deserve that.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So growing up in that chaotic childhood, were there some things that ended up playing out in your relationship?
Yeah, and they did in other dating relationships. I think, I was looking for love in all the wrong places. And, it's kind of that when you're having a conversation, with a young girl and, you're telling her, look out for people who just really don't mean you any good. But, it was kind of like some attention was better than none. And so what I began to find out as we began to date was I had some expectations about relationships, from the negative things that I had seen in my family. And I wanted different than that, but I really didn't know how to get it. And I was expecting some things from people that probably didn't have it to give. And so the part of me kind of giving him a hard time was, you're going to have to really prove to me that you are who you're saying you are. And so, we dated for about a year and a half-ish, before we got serious, I would say. And he had some deficits as well from his childhood experiences and from his family. And being starstruck, love struck, those things like, we'll make it better. We'll get over it. It's not that difficult, but it was.
What were some of those things?
Well, as, in dating, you really don't, dig in. And so, we had conversations about things, what it would be like if we stayed together, what would it be like to raise kids, but those were all hypotheticals. But once actually we were in it, we began to find out that we had a lot of differences. The way that he was raised was different than how I was raised. And those things, are within you. And so we had a lot of things in common, but we had a lot of things that were different as well. And so the things that were different began to take more precedence over the things that were in common. We're both in the military, we're both in the medical field, we both came from households where there were some challenges, but there were a lot of differences in our personalities, a lot of difference in our core values, and differences in our personalities. He was very outgoing and very direct and very upfront, and I kind of analyzed things and, speak when needed to speak, and things like that. So when we were actually married, we had some challenges with distance because we got married and we actually spent some time apart because he was still stationed in another location while I was in school. And so when we really got together and really began to live together, to really know each other, it's like, oh boy,
That's where things started
things began to arise.
be very in your face. Yep.
Yeah. And I think, in some ways we were both stubborn in some areas. We had a conversation I vividly remember. I was in Oklahoma and he was going to be stationed in Korea. And we hadn't gotten married yet, but we had spent some time living together. And he had his mindset on how things were going to go. And I was trying to communicate that I wanted to wait a little bit. I wasn't really ready to I knew I wasn't ready to get married. I didn't really know why. I just knew I wasn't ready. And he was like, well, either we're going to get married or we're not. And I'm not going to ask you again. And I thought, wow, well, that's pretty in your face.
That's very in your face.
But being the balancer that I am, I don't think I fully allowed myself to digest that. And I said, okay, so when do you want to get married? And so we set the date for when he was going to come back from Korea. But I think that those kind of things kind of built some layers. And there were some other things that happened along the way for both of us that I think it just kind of got to a point where things that we had covered up and allowed other things to take precedence over got to the point where we couldn't do that anymore.
And did you have kids?
Yes, we have 2 children. Our daughter is 34 and our son is 28. They're about 5.5 years apart. And those were, we had some challenges, just as, life and any couples do, not because of anything we did or didn't do, but, both of my pregnancies were a little challenging. My daughter was born 2 months premature. She was 2 pounds and 13 ounces when she was born. So that was stressful and challenging. And so we navigated through that. And then, we both agreed that, 2 children would be a good number. And so, 5.5 years late, or 5 years later, 4.5, I guess, I got pregnant with our son, had a miscarriage between our daughter and our son. So that, some psychological impact there. And pregnancy was going pretty well with our son until I went to not my last OBGYN appointment, but pretty close to it. And they were concerned because they saw some things related to heart rate of the fetus and some other things. And so they were like, I think we need to send you to the hospital. And so my husband wasn't expecting that, and I wasn't either. And so they sent me to the hospital by ambulance, and he meets me there. And then we find out that my son was about, gestationally about a week late. And they decided that because of his heart rate, they wanted to go ahead and just induce labor. So here we are again with another event. It seemed like there was always something that just kind of came unexpectedly. And what we found out is that his heart rate was erratic because the umbilical cord was around his neck. But he's healthy, he did well. But it's just, those kinds of things that couples navigate through. Me pushing ahead and being a hard charger, and he was kind of the same. But I think there were a lot of things that we really didn't give time and space to really deal with adequately.
Yeah.
And they had an impact on our marriage.
Yeah. So tell me that now you talk about abundant living. That's what your chapter is about.
Yeah.
What was sort of the turning point for you, when you stepped into that philosophy for yourself?
Yeah, I think there were several little pivots along the way of my adulthood, away from things that weren't healthy and things that didn't seem to be stable, and just knowing that there's got to be more to life than this. Like this has got
Yeah.
to get better. But really, when I worked, after I retired from the military, I still worked for the federal government, and I worked as a social worker. And so when I retired from social work, I knew that I wanted to still do something and be connected to people and be able to give back to people. But I wasn't like really sure how I was going to do that. I knew I didn't want to do clinical counseling anymore. That was for sure. Like
I
I'm
understand.
that.
Yes, you're
But I want to do
exhausting.
something different.
Yeah.
And so I began to hear about coaching, and then I found out there are a lot of kinds of coaches, and I thought, wow, this is a thing. This is a big thing. And so I went on a couple of job interviews thinking, well, maybe I'll work part-time a little bit till I figure this out. And then I realized, no, that's not what you want to do. So I really did some time research. I took about a year after I retired to really research coaching and coaches and what they do and what kinds there were. And I really felt like life coaching really just spoke to me. It felt like a continuation of doing clinical counseling. There were a lot of similarities. And I really wanted to give back to women. And so I began to focus on women and inner healing. And so I did that for a couple of years and then felt like, okay, but then after we get healed, then what do we do? Like, what's the next step? There's got to be something else. And that's when it just kind of came to me that, the best gift that we can give ourselves as a woman or man is to thrive and live abundantly, have the very best life that we possibly can have. And that's what I began to focus on. And I was having probably a moment a couple of years ago. So my mother's birthday was always around Mother's Day. Her birthday is in May. May the 8th. And then my grandmother's birthday was in February, the 20th. So Valentine's Day, Mother's Day were always like, meant something. And so one year after Valentine's Day, the title of my company just came to me. And I thought, oh, that sounds pretty interesting.
What was that?
It was Inner Healing for Abundant Living.
Inner Healing
That's
for
the name of
Abundant Living.
Yeah, so it kind of pulled everything together. And at first I started moving forward continually with women, and then did that just, for the time frame from February to May. And then as I approached the month of May, I always do something to honor my grandmother, honor my mother, whether it's eating something they liked or dressing up, because both of them like to do that. And so this mother and daughter relationship really began to be a passion inwardly. And I thought, I really want to help mothers and adult daughters too. So I began to add that. And then I had the opportunity a year and a half ago in April to do a TEDx talk on mother and daughter relationships. So that really kind of was like the top layer of being able to pull all of that together as a woman and thriving and living abundantly and having good, supportive, healthy mother-daughter relationships. I have an adult daughter. She has a daughter that's 2 years old. So I thought, this has got to continue.
Yeah.
And though my mother and grandmother are no longer living, but I learned a lot from the women in my family. About womanhood and just about, as you said, you deserve that, and, how a woman should be treated, and all those challenges in life that we have as women. I saw several women in my family go through some difficult times. So however I could come alongside women and mothers and adult daughters to help heal, mend the relationships, have them have the kind of relationships in life that they desire to have, that's what I wanted to do.
What is one of the most rewarding success stories you've witnessed?
Oh, goodness. There are probably two. One would be in two different age groups. The first one would be a young lady. She's in her early 30s. And I always say I get to come alongside women and support them. And she was having some struggles with confidence and really owning her value and worth. And had some, as I could, identify with, some relationships that didn't really mean her best. They didn't really have her best in mind. And so as we kind of worked through what her core challenges were, and to see her kind of come out of that and not settle for being in a relationship that didn't honor her was really rewarding. And the second one, and they both still are, I still have contact with them, is a woman that's in her 60s and has gotten to the point where she's like, okay, so what about me? I've given to my family, I've helped my children and grandchildren and godchildren and spouse, but what about me? And just, helping her to see that she matters, and that until she can really feel some kind of fulfillment with who she is and in her life, she's not really bringing her best into the other relationships. And she was able to kind of break through that. And she's still, breaking through some things, but that was really rewarding as well.
Those are wonderful. Well, thank you so much for telling your story today. And I absolutely love you being able to tell people, how you were able to get through it, what you've learned, and help others. Can you just, in the last few minutes, tell us what's next for you?
Yeah, I want to add to that. I believe in counseling. I've had counseling myself, and actually, as I was going through writing my chapter, I got counseling.
I understand.
Up, and I was like, I need to talk to somebody.
Yeah.
So, when you need it, and if you're able to access it, take advantage of, whatever services those are that you may need, whether they're financial or, mental health or physical health. All of those things have helped me at different points in my life. What's next for me? I want to do more speaking. At some point, I guess I'll take that chapter and make it a smaller little book. There's more I could add.
There you go.
Yeah, but I definitely want to be a listening ear, and definitely, sometimes even a shoulder to cry on, but to continue to come alongside women and coach them, and men as well. I love the relationship of seeing a father and just loving on his daughter or daughters, and I know what that's like, and the giving of that on both sides. So I'm really starting to lean into that area as well, and help fathers with their adult daughters, or daughters with their fathers, because those relationships change as you become an adult. So those are the things that are next.
Well, I cannot relate, because I have this feeling that you might be taking that chapter and making that into a book.
Then we've got the Women Thrive Summit coming up.
Yes, we do. Women Thrive. Is that going to kind of kick off your speaking?
I've done some before, but I think that will help to, that international platform. It's virtual, it's free, so come on and join us. I'll be on the Friday, it's the 17th to the 21st of March. My talk is on the 17th from 11 a.m. to 11:45 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. It's free. You can come in and out as many times during that week as you like.
Yes. Oh, let's start speaking and helping others. I love that. Thank you so much for your time today.
All right, that's a wrap for today on Love and Trauma, the real deal. big thanks to my guests for sharing their insights. Couldn't have done it without you. Now, for those of you looking to take this journey further, I've got something special. Head to my website to grab Real Tactics, Real Healing, a survivor's playbook for navigating a relationship with a trauma survivor. It's packed with everything you need to know, do, and say to navigate the emotional minefield, find your balance, and regain your self-worth and happiness.